The first thing I noticed was that she was laughing before she even sat down at something the hostess had said. A real laugh, the kind that takes up room, and the second thing I noticed was that my cousin Marcus was watching my face from across the restaurant the way a man watches a fuse he has just lit. He had set this up. He had called me 3 days ago and said, "I know someone, she's incredible, trust me." And I had said yes, because I had been saying no for 2 years, and my mother had started using a specific tone when she asked about my life that I could not bear anymore. I had said yes, and I had driven 40 minutes, and I was sitting at a table for 4 with Marcus and his wife Diane. And the woman walking toward us was not what Marcus had led me to imagine. She was bigger than any woman I had dated. The word came into my head, and I am going to say it because this is the honest version of the story. Obese. She was wearing a yellow dress, and her hair was up, and she was still laughing at whatever the hostess had said, and Marcus was watching my face. And I felt my face do a thing I did not choose, a small involuntary recalibration, and I knew Marcus had seen it, and I knew that what happened in the next 60 seconds was going to be the thing everyone at that table remembered about me for the rest of my life. Her name was Priya. She sat down across from me and she looked at me directly, the way confident people look at you. Not a challenge, just a clear-eyed assessment, and she said, "You're James. Marcus said you were quiet." He said it like it was a warning, and I said, "It's not a warning, it's a survival strategy." And she said, "For who? You or everyone else?" And I said, "Whoever needs it most that day." And she looked at me for a second, and then she smiled, and Marcus exhaled beside me in a way he probably thought I couldn't hear. I want to back up, because to understand what happened that night, you need to understand what the 2 years before it had looked like, and to understand that you need to understand that I am a person who thought he knew what he wanted and turned out to be wrong in a way that took losing it to figure out. Her name was Vanessa. We were together for 3 years. We were, by every surface measurement, well-matched, same background, similar careers. She was beautiful in the way I had always told myself I was looking for, which is to say in the way that made other men look at me differently when she walked into a room with me. I am telling you this because I want you to know I understood, even then, that the thing I valued was not quite what I thought I valued, and I told myself it was fine, and I told myself it would deepen into something else, and what it deepened into was Vanessa leaving on a Thursday afternoon with 3 suitcases and a very calm face, and saying, "On the way out the door, James, you have been dating what I look like for 3 years. I'm exhausted. I hope you figure out the difference." And she closed the door, and I stood in the hallway of my apartment, and I did not cry, which is the part that scared me the most. I stood there and I thought I should be crying, and the fact that I wasn't told me something I spent the next 2 years trying not to hear. So when Priya sat down across from me in a yellow dress, laughing at something the hostess had said, I was 2 years out from a relationship I had grieved less than I expected and learned from more than I wanted to admit. I was 34 years old. I was a person who had spent 2 years being careful about the things Vanessa had told me I'd been careless with, and who had been so careful that I had stopped going on dates entirely, and who had said yes to Marcus because my mother's tone had gotten completely unbearable, and who had felt his face do a small involuntary thing when a woman in a yellow dress walked toward him laughing. That thing my face did, I want to be honest about it, because the honest version is the only version worth telling. It was not disgust. I want to be clear about that. It was surprise, and then something faster and less comfortable than surprise. Something that was about me and not about Priya. something that was my own catalog of what I had always assumed I was looking for, rising up and saying, "This is not that." It lasted about 2 seconds. And then Priya looked at me and said the thing about Marcus's warning, and I said the thing about survival strategies, and she said the thing about who needed it, and the catalog closed. Not because I decided to close it, because she was more interesting than it. We talked for 4 hours. Marcus and Diane, who I understand now had planned this very carefully, found reasons to be elsewhere at the table for most of it. They went to the bar. They ran into someone they knew near the hostess stand. They were present enough that the table did not feel abandoned, and absent enough that Priya and I talked the way people talk when they forget they are being observed. She was a physiotherapist. She worked primarily with athletes recovering from injuries, and she talked about the body the way someone talks about a thing they have studied so long it has become a language, with a precision and a warmth that I had never heard anyone use about anything they did for work. She said, at one point, people think recovery is about pain management. It's actually about teaching someone to trust the thing that broke them. The body that failed you is the same body that heals you. You have to reconcile those two facts before anything gets better. And she said it the way she said everything, simply, looking at me. And I held the sentence in my chest, and I understood that she was talking about physiotherapy, and I was hearing something else. She asked about me. I am an audio engineer. I work primarily on documentary film scores, the music that lives under the narration that tells you how to feel about what you are watching without you noticing it is telling you. I told her this, and she leaned forward slightly, not in the performed way people lean forward to show interest, but in the way people lean forward when they have actually just heard something, and she said, "So you make the thing that does the most work and gets the least credit." And I said, "That's exactly what it is." And she said, "I know that job. I have that job. Every athlete who comes back from surgery gets credited for their mental toughness and their dedication. Nobody credits the 12 people who handled their body while they were learning to trust it again." And I said, "Does that bother you?" And she said, "It used to." Now I think being the thing that does the most work and gets the least credit is the most important job in any room, and I have stopped needing the room to know it. I said, "That is either very healthy or the most convincing thing a person in pain has ever said to me." She said, "Which do you think it is?" I said, "I think it started as one and became the other." She said, "You're quiet and you're not slow. Marcus undersold you." Marcus, from the bar, caught my eye over her shoulder and raised his glass exactly 1 centimeter, the smallest possible celebratory gesture, and I looked away before Priya could turn around. At 9:15, she checked her phone, not furtively the way people check their phones when they are bored, but directly, and she said, "I have to go." Early clinic. She stood up and she said to Marcus and Diane, who had drifted back to the table in the last half hour, "This was lovely. You are both terrible liars, and I mean that as a compliment." And Diane said, "We told you it would be worth the drive." And Priya said, "You told me he was quiet. You did not tell me the rest of it." And I said, "What's the rest of it?" And she looked at me one more time, that clear-eyed direct look, and she said, "Ask Marcus." And she put on her coat and she left, and the room felt different after the way a room feels different after live music stops. Marcus waited approximately 4 seconds. He said, "Well," I said, "you should have told me." He said, "Told you what?" I said, "What she looked like." Marcus put his drink down. Diane looked at her hands. The table went the kind of quiet a table goes when something real has just been said in a restaurant, and the music is still playing, and the other tables are still talking, but the 4 square feet you are sitting in have gone completely still. Marcus said, I told you she was incredible. I said, you know what I mean. He said, I know exactly what you mean. I didn't tell you because I knew if I told you, you would not have come. And I needed you to come. Because I have been watching you for 2 years since Vanessa, and I have been watching you do the same math you have always done. And getting the same answer, and James, the answer is wrong. I've known it was wrong since before Vanessa left. She left because she knew it was wrong. I set this up because I needed you to sit across from Priya Anand for 4 hours before you ran the numbers, and I needed you to find out what the numbers are for yourself, and I need you to tell me right now, at this table, what you think. I said, I think she is the most interesting person I have talked to in 2 years. Marcus said, I know. I said, I think when she left the room felt different. Diane said very quietly, I know. I said, and I think I almost didn't come tonight because of what she looked like, and I think that is a sentence I am going to have to sit with for a long time. Nobody said anything. The music played. Marcus picked up his drink. I said, does she know? That I didn't know. Marcus said, she knows. She always knows. She agreed to come anyway because I told her you were worth it, and I am now waiting to find out if I was right. I drove home that night, and I sat in my car in the parking garage of my building for 35 minutes, and I did not go upstairs. I sat there with the engine off, and I thought about what Vanessa had said at the door 3 years ago, and about what Priya had said about the body that breaks you being the same body that heals you, and I thought about the 2 seconds when my face had done the thing it did, and I thought about Marcus watching my face when she walked in. And I thought about 4 hours of a conversation that had felt like being given water after a very long time of not knowing I was thirsty. And I thought about what I was going to do in the morning. In the morning, I texted Marcus. I said, I'd like her number if she'll give it. He replied in 4 minutes, which told me he had been waiting. He said, already asked. She said, ask her yourself. She's in the book. Priya Anand, City Physio on Halsted. I sat with my phone in my hand and I understood that Priya had known I would either text Marcus within 24 hours or not text him at all. And she had known which one it should be. And she had made me do it the right way. I called the clinic at 10 in the morning and I asked to speak to Priya Anand, and the receptionist put me on hold for 2 minutes, and then Priya picked up and said, you called the clinic. I said, you didn't give Marcus your number to give me. She said, I don't give my number to someone who spends the first 2 seconds of meeting me deciding whether I'm worth talking to. There was no anger in it. It was a fact, stated with the same precision she used for everything else. I said 2 seconds. She said it was 2. I counted. I always count. And then you said the thing about survival strategies, and I decided to stay for dinner. But I don't give my number to the 2 seconds. I give it to what came after. I said, that's a meaningful distinction. She said, it's the only meaningful distinction. I said, I'd like to take you to dinner. Real dinner. Planned, not a setup. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Saturday 7, I'll send you the place. And she hung up, and I sat in my kitchen, and I understood that I was already operating inside her terms, and that this was entirely correct. Saturday was 3 days away, and I used all 3 of them badly. I used them doing the thing I had been doing for 2 years, which was a kind of audit I had developed after Vanessa, an honest accounting of my own patterns that I had gotten very good at performing and very bad at acting on. I sat in my apartment and I thought about every relationship I had been in since I was 22, and I thought about the through line. And the through line was not complicated. I had always dated women who looked a certain way. Not a type, exactly, a category. A category that had to do with how I imagined I appeared to the world when I was with them. I had been aware of this since Vanessa named it on the way out the door. I had been aware of it, and I had responded by not dating anyone, which is the coward's version of changing. I had put the math on hold and told myself I was healing, and then Marcus had called, and I had said yes, and I had felt my face do the thing it did. And now I had a dinner on Saturday with a woman who had counted the 2 seconds and decided to stay anyway, and I understood that I did not deserve the dinner, and I was going to show up for it and try to become someone who did. Priya had sent the name of a small Japanese restaurant I had never heard of on a block I did not know well, and when I arrived, she was already there, at a table without a good sightline to the door, which I noticed because I always take the seat with the sightline, and I understood she was not going to manage my comfort. She was in a blue top and her hair was down, and she looked up when I came in the same way she had looked up at the restaurant with Marcus, directly, and she said, "You look nervous." I said, "I am nervous." She said, "Why?" I said, "Because I want to do this correctly, and I have a recent history of not doing it correctly." She said, "What does correctly mean to you right now?" And I said, "Being here for the right reasons." And she said, "What are the wrong reasons?" And I said, "Coming because I had a good 4 hours, and I'm chasing that feeling without examining what was underneath the 2 seconds." And Priya put her menu down, and she looked at me with the expression of a person who has been handed something they were not sure they were going to receive, and she said, "Okay, tell me about the 2 seconds." I told her. I told her the whole thing, Vanessa, the suitcases, the specific sentence on the way out the door, the 2 years of performing self-awareness without doing the actual work of it, the moment in the parking garage on Tuesday night. I talked for probably 12 minutes, and Priya did not interrupt once, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment. And then she said, "Can I tell you something that is going to sound harsh?" I said, "Yes." She said, "The 2 seconds are not your problem. Everybody has 2 seconds. I have 2 seconds when someone new sits down across from me. We all run a fast assessment. It's physiological. You cannot opt out of it. And beating yourself up for having it is just another way of making this about you instead of about me. The 2 seconds are not the thing I'm watching. I'm watching what happens after the 2 seconds. And after your 2 seconds, you said something real, and you listened for 4 hours, and you called the clinic instead of getting my number from Marcus, and you showed up tonight and told me the truth before the appetizers arrived. The 2 seconds are the entrance exam. You passed it on day 1. What I am watching now is whether you can stay in the room. I said, "What does staying in the room mean?" She said, "It means that when your friends ask about who you're dating, you tell them without editing. It means that when you walk into a party with me, you don't position yourself in a way that looks like you're not with me. It means that when the old calculation comes back, and it will come back because you have run it for a long time and it is a well-grooved path. You notice it and you don't act on it, and you don't make me carry it. I am not asking you to be a different person than you are. I am asking you to be a person who does not outsource his discomfort onto me. I have been outsourced to my entire adult life. I am extremely good at recognizing it. I am done tolerating it." I said, "How long does someone get to prove that?" She said, "Depends on how fast they move. Some people take a month, some people take a year and then crack at a work event. I have learned to watch for the work event. That is usually where I find out what I need to know." I said, "What happens at the work event?" She said, "Someone introduces me to someone else, and I watch how they do it. Whether they stand close or drift, whether they say my name first or trail me in like a footnote, whether they look at my face or watch the other person's face to see how they're reacting. The introduction is the whole story. I can read it in about 2 seconds. Actually, she smiled when she said the last part, and I laughed, and then I said, I have a work event in 3 weeks. A screening for a documentary I scored. There will be a lot of people from my industry there. Directors, producers, people who have known me for years. And Priya looked at me, and I looked at her, and I said, I would like you to come with me to the screening. As the first test, not after a month of dinners. Now, 3 weeks from now. I would like to do the thing you watch for first, so that you do not spend 3 months waiting for it, and so that I do not spend 3 months knowing it is coming. She was quiet for a long enough time that I started to understand I might have said the wrong thing. Then she said, that is either the most self-aware offer I have ever received, or the most sophisticated way anyone has tried to preempt my methodology. I said, it's both. In that order. She said, all right. The screening. 3 weeks. I will be watching. I said, I know. She said, don't practice. If you practice, it'll be wrong. Just do it the way it comes. I said, okay, she said, order the fish. It's the best thing here. And we ordered the fish, and we ate, and we talked for 3 more hours, and when we left, she hugged me briefly on the sidewalk outside, and the hug lasted exactly the right amount of time, which is to say it did not have a question in it. The 3 weeks between the dinner and the screening were the most deliberately conscious 3 weeks of my adult life. I went to work. I finished the score, a 40-minute piece I had been living inside for 8 months, and finishing it should have felt like something, and it did. But the feeling that came with it was smaller than usual, because a larger part of my attention was somewhere else for the first time in 2 years. I talked to Marcus on the phone twice, and he did not ask about Priya, and I did not tell him. Because I understood that what was building between us was not yet ready to become a story other people held. I called my mother on a Sunday, and she used the tone, the one she had been deploying with increasing precision for 2 years, the one that was not quite a question and not quite a reproach, but contained both in equal measure, and I said, Mom, I'm seeing someone. I'll tell you more when I know more. And she said, what do you know so far? And I said, she's a physiotherapist. She works with athletes. She's one of the most precise thinkers I have ever sat across from, and she makes me feel like I have been speaking a language I only half knew my whole life. And my mother was quiet, and then she said, do you like her? And I said, very much. And my mother said, then that is enough to know for now. And I said, yes, and that was the conversation, and it was enough. The night of the screening arrived. The venue was a theater in the Arts District, about 200 people. The kind of event where everyone knows roughly everyone, and introductions happen in clusters near the bar. I picked Priya up at her apartment, and she came to the door in a dark green dress and her hair up, and she looked at me and said, you're nervous again. I said, differently nervous than last time. She said, good different or bad different. I said, the kind of nervous that means something matters. And she nodded, and she picked up her coat, and we went. The first introduction happened near the entrance, 7 minutes in. My producer, a man named Carl, who I had known for 11 years, who had been to my apartment, who knew about Vanessa, who had asked me twice in the past year if I was seeing anyone, came toward me through the crowd with his wife. I watched myself from a slight distance, the way Priya had taught me to watch, and I felt the old calculation run its path for exactly 2 seconds, and then I stepped toward Carl with Priya beside me. Not slightly behind me, beside me, and I said, Carl, I want you to meet Priya Anand. I said her name first. I said it before I said anything about her, before I said anything about myself, before I contextualized her as anything other than a person whose name was Priyanand and who was standing with me. Carl shook her hand and said something warm, and Priya said something precise and funny back, and Carl's wife laughed, and Carl looked at me over Priya's shoulder with an expression I have known his face to make for 11 years only when something genuinely surprises him. I looked back at him steadily, and I felt something settle in my chest that I want to describe accurately. It was not pride, exactly. It was the feeling of a door closing on a room I had been living in for a long time, closing quietly, the way a door closes when the person leaving finally knows they are not coming back. There were 9 more introductions that night. I did all 9 of them the same way. I said her name first. I stood close. I did not watch the other person's face. I watched hers. In the 3rd introduction, she said something about documentary scores that was so specific and so unexpected that the director she was talking to stopped mid-sip and said, "How do you know about score placement in observational docs?" And Priya said, "I've been doing homework." And she said it to the director, but she looked at me when she said it. And I had to look away for a second because I did not want the director to read my face. After the film, in the lobby, Marcus appeared, because of course Marcus was there, and he looked at Priya, and he looked at me. And he did not say anything, he just did the 1 centimeter glass raise again, and Priya, who had been watching, said to me quietly, "Is that what that means?" And I said, "He's been doing it since we were 12. And she said, "I like him." And she said it with a warmth that meant she had already understood everything Marcus had done to make that evening possible. We stood outside after, on the sidewalk, while a cab went by. She said 9 introductions. I said, "I counted 2. She said, "You said my name first every time." I said, "I know." She said, "I watched for the drift. It didn't happen." I said, "I know." She said, "You looked at my face." I said, "It's the most interesting face in the room. It wasn't an effort." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I want to tell you something I have not told anyone who has taken me to an event." I said, "Okay." She said, "I spend the entire time at these things waiting for the moment I described to you at dinner, the drift, the footnote, the scan of the other face. I have been going to events with people for 15 years, and I have been waiting at all of them. Tonight, I stopped waiting after the first introduction. I have never stopped waiting after the first introduction. I don't know what to do with a night where I didn't have to wait." I said, "You could let it be the new normal." She said, "That is either a very kind sentence or a very large promise." I said, "It's both. In that order." She laughed. The cab that had gone by came back around the block, which I did not think was possible on that street, and she flagged it. She got in, and she looked at me through the window for a second, and then the cab pulled away, and I stood on the sidewalk in the Arts District at 10:45 on a Thursday night. And I thought about a woman in a yellow dress walking toward a table, laughing at something the hostess had said before she even sat down. And I thought about the 2 seconds. And I thought about what she had told me about the body that breaks you being the same body that heals you. And I thought about the fact that I had spent 3 years with Vanessa counting other people's reactions to how she looked, and that I had spent the whole of tonight looking at Priya's face. I want to tell you what Marcus said on the phone the next morning, because it is the sentence that put the whole shape of the thing into words I had not found myself. I called him at 8, and he picked up immediately, and I said, "You were right." And Marcus said, "I know I was right. Tell me what you learned." And I said that the calculation I've been running since I was 22 is measuring the wrong thing, that I have been selecting for how I look when I'm next to someone, and I told myself that was about attraction, and it wasn't about attraction, it was about fear. Fear of being with someone who doesn't confirm the version of myself I want other people to see. And Marcus was quiet, and then he said, "James, that is the most honest sentence you have ever said to me about this. Who taught you to say it that way?" And I said, "She did." And Marcus said, "Good, don't lose her." And I said, "I'm trying." And Marcus said, "You don't try with something like this. You just stop doing the thing you were doing before. That's all it is. You stop and you stay." That was 14 months ago. Bria and I have been together since the screening. I told my mother a month later at a Sunday dinner, and my mother shook Bria's hand for a long time, and Bria said to her quietly something I was not supposed to hear but did, which was, "He's trying to stay in the room. I think he's going to make it." And my mother said, "He'd better." And Priya laughed, the laugh she had walking toward me the first night, the one that takes up room. I met Priya's family at month 3, a dinner at her parents' house with her sister and brother-in-law and her 2 nephews, and her father asked me what I did for work, and when I told him, he turned to Priya and he said, in the tone of a father who has been watching his daughter navigate a world that did not always see her clearly, "He does the most important work in the room and doesn't need the room to know it." And Priya said, "I know, Baba, that's why." And I sat at that table and I understood that she had talked about me to her father before she brought me, and that what she had said was not that I was the audio engineer, but that I was the person who understood what it meant to do the work that does not get credited, and that her father had understood what that meant about me, and that I had not earned that understanding. I had been extended it on loan against a future I was going to have to be worth. I want to be careful about how I end this, because the easy version of this story ends with me having been redeemed by love, and I want to push back on that shape. I was not redeemed. I am a person who had a 2-second reaction, and who noticed having it, and who told the truth about noticing it, and who showed up to a screening and said a woman's name before he said anything else. That is not redemption. That is a minimum. That is the floor, not the ceiling. What I am still working on, 14 months in, is the part Priya called the well-grooved path. The calculation does come back. It comes back when I am tired, or when I am in a room full of people I want to impress. It comes back in a version that is faster and quieter than it was 2 years ago, because I have learned to catch it, but it comes back. What has changed is that I do not act on it, and I do not give it to Priya to carry. And when I catch it, I say something honest about it, either to Marcus or to myself on a drive, and then I go back into the room and I stay. Staying is not a grand gesture. It is a daily decision that does not feel dramatic from the inside. It only looks like something from the outside, from the angle of the people who watched me not drift at 9 introductions on a Thursday night. Marcus got it right the first time, and in one sentence he said to me on the phone, he said, "You stop and you stay." That is all it is. You stop doing the thing you were doing and you stay. I stopped. I am staying. And I will tell you something I have not told anyone yet, something Priya does not know I am going to say, because I am saying it here first, in a room full of people she has never met. Which feels right, because she told me on our second dinner that she likes when truth gets said in front of witnesses. I am going to ask her to marry me. I am going to do it in a small way, not a big gesture, not a public spectacle, because she would find a public spectacle exhausting, and I know the difference now between what I would want and what she would want. I am going to do it in a room with no one watching, just the two of us, and I am going to say her name first, because that is the thing I do now. And I am going to ask her, and then the answer will be hers, and whatever the answer is, I will have said the true sentence, and that is the only thing I am in charge of. So I want to ask you two things before I go, and I want you to sit with both of them, because they are the questions I have been sitting with for 14 months, and if either of them puts a specific person in your mind, I want you to tell me about that person in the comments, because I read every one, and the ones I come back to are the ones where someone names the thing they have been, calculating, out loud, in a place where other people can hear it. Have you ever sat across from someone and realized, somewhere in the first few minutes, that the story you had already written about them before they opened their mouth was not just wrong, but was actually a story about you? About the version of yourself you have been trying to protect, and that the person in front of you was more interesting than the story, and that you had almost missed them because the story was louder and the harder one. What is the well-grooved calculation you have been running? The one you have mistaken for a preference or a standard when it is actually a fear? And what would it cost you to put it down this week? Not in some abstract future, but this week, in the next room you walk into with someone who deserves to have their name said first? If tonight's story found you, tell me about it below. And subscribe, because there is a follow-up to this one, and it is about the night Priya told me what she said to her father before she brought me home, and about what her father said back, and about the question I have not asked yet.